All right. Good morning, Buckeyes. Let's go ahead and get started. So hopefully you guys are doing well. How are things? Good, bad? Just kind of plugging along?
Yeah.
Plugging along? Yeah, I asked Dr. Oakley how his class is doing. He said everyone seemed kind of tired, ready to be done, but hanging in there. Sounds about right for this morning. Yeah.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, I hear you guys. Well, hopefully our zoo theme will get us going this morning. So we have our zoo theme. So I have a picture of the Columbus Zoo behind me. So our own in our own backyard. Fortunate to have that. Very sad we won't be getting there at least anytime soon. Hopefully by the end of the summer. Also too in chat I put up zoo noises. So if you want to kind of play along with it, it's actually been fun. I've been listening to it, waiting for class to get started kind of earlier this morning, and there's some fun, interesting noises. It does make you actually feel like you're in a zoo to the extent that you can, while also learning about stereotyping and prejudice. So it's a big kind of weird mix for today. I'll say that I did actually have a meeting once at the Columbus Zoo. It was a fun meeting. We were meeting in the middle of the summertime, and we were talking about how to do the social psychology writing course. So tips and tricks for being successful with it, how to design it, some questions we had towards it. And I remember there really being kind of three distinct things about it. One is that trying to get professors to go to a meeting in the middle of the summertime is really hard to do. We're not really inclined to do meetings to begin with, much less in the middle of the summertime. So in our 45-minute drive there, we decided that if we needed to leave, we all were going to leave together because we drove together, and the strength in numbers, and that we would just start talking about Sweden. And I can't remember why we picked Sweden, but we just said, like, if you just need to leave, if you just need to get out of there, just it's okay. Just start talking about Sweden. No judgment. We won't ask any questions. And I swear, as soon as we walked in, we just started going, "Hey, I heard the weather's great in Sweden. Like, I've always wanted to visit Sweden." We were just like, "Get out of there!" It was like Sweden this, Sweden that. But it was really entertaining in the sense that all of a sudden you just hear this weird animal noise, and like everyone had to stop and listen. Like, it was one of the few times, like in a meeting, in a real meeting, not a virtual meeting, everyone just stopped because it was so weird. I'll also say that Dr. Oakley and I went on like this pirates ride together. It was like the highlight of the day. We snuck away at lunch and like went on this ride, and we're like, "Oh, I bet our kids would love this." So we made sure to record it and then like show our kids, just to like tease them that we were all having fun all day and that they were stuck at school and things like that. So yeah, so I have fond memories of this situation. So hopefully you guys jump in, throw the zoo background on in the background of Zoom if you'd like, and throw on the loop, the noise loop. Is kind of fun and entertaining. So we are going to get into things today. We are going to finish talking about stereotyping and prejudice. We've been talking about it for quite a bit. But in thinking about that, as I told you guys before, I actually teach a whole class on this. So to spend a little bit of extra time on it, especially since we did a little bit of talking on Tuesday about kind of the current situation, I think makes sense, and is worth spending that time. And I'll say that while we have a little bit left, these are important last points. So please don't dismiss them just because we're covering them kind of later on in the process. So we will get stereotyping and prejudice wrapped up today. I promise to that. And then we'll get into talking about aggression, leaving us then with talking about aggression and pro-social behavior next week. And those are both topics I think you guys will be able to grasp rather quickly and be in good shape. Many of you guys said that you liked kind of how we switched the format up yesterday. We're going to do a little bit of a hybrid of it today with kind of the jungle theme and some music playing and stuff like that. But I am going to leave the slides up. The reason why that is, I think it's easier to follow for those who are not here, who are watching it on YouTube. And we do have more people who will be doing that than here in class. So we might switch up a little bit as we go along. My hope is to go back to kind of how we did it on Tuesday next week. But I think today's a little bit rough for people getting here, getting to class. So sorry to those of you that are here. I super appreciate it. We'll do a little bit of hybrid of things, but I think we will keep the slides up. Maybe at different points I'll move out of it for just to kind of change it up a bit there too. So thank you for the feedback that I got. I appreciate it. Seems like you guys enjoyed kind of the switch up the format. We'll get back to that maybe a little bit today at different points and next week for sure. So let me make sure we're set on a couple announcements, check in with you guys, and then we'll go ahead and get into stereotyping prejudice, get into content for today. So the first thing in terms of announcements is don't forget to do writing assignment number 4, number 5. These are both due before class next Thursday. Working on them over the weekend is a great time to get them done. Again, one's a little bit longer as you're going to be applying stereotyping and prejudice. to understand the COVID virus situation right now. And the other is just kind of reflecting back on the class. Usually that's one that we complete the very last day of class, and it's a nice way to wrap class up. I wanted to give you guys some time to work on it, so we introduced it a bit earlier. So make sure that you're taking some time to do that. Also, too, I want to say I appreciated the conversation at the beginning of class on Tuesday. It was great to hear from you guys. Check in, kind of get a sense of what was working, what wasn't working, to connect. Hopefully you guys kind of walked away with that, kind of having a better sense of kind of how other classmates are feeling, how professors are feeling as we're trying to, make things the best we can. And so hopefully you got a lot out of that. I know I appreciate it, and I learned a lot too. Some things that we can make changes to, even just the last little bit that we have here. So again, I appreciate that. If there's follow-ups that you want to have either with me, you can email me, we can Zoom chat, anything like that. Or if there's other things as we go along that you want me to know, for sure, let me know about that. But thank you again. I did want to say too that the SEIs are open now. So please take a minute to do those course evaluations. I know the courses are all kind of weird because we started one way and the course became kind of something different, some cases entirely different, some cases like ours we were able to hold relatively consistent. Please take some time to do those SEIs. I always look at them very carefully. I make adjustments based on the feedback that I get. If something went well, I make sure to continue doing it or do it a little bit more. If there's things that were problematic, I make adjustments. I don't want to see those things continue to happen if we can improve how things are going for your learning. The biggest issue that we have with SEIs is we get such a low response rate that we can't really make any judgments. So if I only hear from 3 or 4 people, I don't know if they're representative of the class. So please take some time in this class and other classes to do this. You can access them from Carmen. There's an online app. There's all kinds of ways to get to the SEIs now. So please take some time to do that if you can. If you're too busy with things, I more than understand that. I know it's a tough situation that you're balancing things out, but I just want to let you guys know those SEIs are hugely important. In fact, Northwestern over a decade ago made it that you had to complete SEIs to get your grades back. And I kind of wish we had that system as well. I know it's a little bit more onerous on you guys, but I think it gives you lots of important feedback. And remember too, you can look at professors' evaluations before you select classes too. So that's where those SEIs are also helpful. So with all this being said, I want to pause just for a minute like I try to do to see if you guys have any questions, things that you want to go back to from conversation on Tuesday, anything else that I can help with that. Okay, so just a reminder, we do have Zoo theme going on today. I did send out the link in the chat box for where you can listen to Zoo sounds. It actually is pretty entertaining. I've been enjoying it this morning. We will do a little bit of hybrid with that and kind of our standard lecture notes, but again, we'll flip out of things. So again, there's some stuff that we're going to be covering that's important for us. We are going to wrap up talking about stereotyping and prejudice. So I want you to stay as focused as you can on these last 2 pieces. So don't dismiss this just because we're wrapping things up, because they're really important pieces. So let's get into them. One of the things I think is really important for us to think about is automatic and controlled processes as it relates to stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And what is really important here is that prejudice and stereotyping involves both automatic and controlled processes. And this is nothing new to us, this idea of automatic and controlled processes. So someone kind of give me just a quick explanation and kind of a quick thought, a quick description of what do we think of when we think of talking about automatic and controlled processes. So what are these 2 different types of processes that we go through? Okay, and you can type it out, you can shout it out. When we talk about something being an automatic versus a controlled process, what are we kind of denoting there? What's the difference between the 2? Okay, and you can remember we talked about this in terms of social influence. We talked about this in terms of attitudes. We talked about at least in 1 or 2 other contexts where we're talking about things as being automatic versus controlled.
I feel like if it's automatic, like it happens more quickly and it's like our first impression of something, and then
Okay.
Controlled is more like, I don't know, I feel like you like kind of adjust what your automatic thinking was, like based on like the context or the situation, like.
Okay, I think that's a great answer. I think it does a great job, especially for this morning, of kind of explaining how we think about things. Okay, so we can take kind of our automatic process, which I think you described well, as being this process that, hang on a second, this process where we do things as it says automatically, happens without a lot of careful thinking. It's kind of our first response to something going on. It's a very quick response. In the case of interacting with someone else, it might be the immediate impression that you form of that person. It might be something where you're not cognitively, deciding that you're going to carefully think about who you're interacting with and how you're interacting with them. It's something that just kind of comes to you. Versus that controlled process, you can say, well, I'm going to make sure I really learn about this person. I'm going to be careful not to just use the categorization of that person to make decisions. I'm going to slow things down. I think that was a good part of what Cassie said. Slow things down, kind of override to some degree that automatic process. And what I'm going to highlight when we talk about this automatic versus controlled process is when we use the automatic versus controlled process as we interact and go about kind of our regulated everyday interactions. Because we're going to see that that's where stereotypes really start to become a salient component of how we operate and how we interact with others. In terms of, are we using these stereotypes as our automatic process? Or are we being careful to control these processes in the sense that we're going to make sure that we're going to kind of override our stereotypes or override our natural affective response to have a different interaction? And you're going to see a lot like what we talked about with social influence. It's hard to override some of these automatic processes. It requires resources, it requires time, it requires the ability to have effort. That when given an opportunity to just think about something in an automatic way, that's what we very well may end up going with. Okay, so again, this is where we talk about how stereotypes are maybe bad in terms of their application, but how in terms of their functions, they actually may help us think about things more automatically. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through kind of these different processes, different experiences that we have, and I want you to keep an eye out when we have automatic versus controlled processes. When do we kind of switch back and forth between these? That's kind of what we're setting up here going forward. Okay. So we know with stereotypes that we can use them as heuristics. Okay, so remember, heuristics are just kind of these mental shortcuts we make. Okay, we make these mental shortcuts that, a better product is one that's more expensive, that women are more nurturing than men. These heuristics that, in the morning, if you're a morning person, it's easier to do things compared to the afternoon. Okay, we'll actually see this kind of play out in terms of some research we'll look at. Okay, this heuristics that if a professor starts talking extensively about a topic, it's more likely to show up on the exam. Or in my case, if I tell you guys, this is classic research. These mental shortcuts that kind of allow you to think about things quickly. Okay, if you've gone with a particular brand before, it's been a good brand, you kind of stay with that. Okay. Now, in terms of stereotypes as heuristics and automatic thinking, we see that attitudes form almost immediately, and they aid in ease, speed, and quality of decision making. Okay, so if you just go back a little bit to where we're talking about attitudes, in our section on attitudes, we talked about how we have attitudes towards everything. Okay, so we evaluate things quickly, even a series of letters, even kind of nonsense words, we categorize them as positive or negative. And that categorization process helps us to kind of think about the information, to work with it, to do the things that we need to with it. And this is the same thing that happens with stereotypes. So attitudes form immediately. That means that they aid speed, ease, and quality of decision making, in the sense that if we have these attitudes, which can be captured in the sense of stereotypes, it allows us to then go through that interaction faster, with less cognitive effort, and it can enhance your quality decision making. It can help you to kind of decide how you want to interact with that person. So let me hint at the second point here, and then we'll kind of pull these two together, because one of the second things that happens is that categorization occurs. Right? You interact with someone, the first thing that you do is you categorize that person. It's an inherent natural instinct that we have. It's part of our processes, it's part of the way that we do things. Now, that categorization usually is based on age, gender, and race. Okay, so whenever you're interacting with someone else, you look at those three characteristics, so age, gender, and race. And some of that categorization then is to decide if this person is an in-group member or an out-group member. Some of this categorization also is done too because it starts to then allow you to enact stereotypes. Okay, so if you're interacting with an older female woman, you might perceive her as being kind of warm and nurturing. Okay, those stereotypes might be instantly activated. And because of that, you might treat her in a way that brings out those characteristics of her. Okay, you might treat her in a way that you're trying to be kind and empathetic to her. And in doing that too, she might then express those stereotypes back. The idea here is between these first two is that once we categorize, these attitudes are immediately formed, these stereotypes are instantly activated, and that then makes that interaction easier to have. And now you have some basic information about how you might want to work with that person, how you might want to communicate with them. It allows the interaction to go faster, so you're not sitting there kind of trying to think about the person, process things. And it may improve the quality of decision making in the sense that now you know how to interact with that person. You have some basis for some information when you're just initially meeting that person, especially. Now, what also becomes part of this too is that these stereotypes can start to get learned. Okay, so they can be learned through continual interactions with those of particular groups. They can be learned through social media. Okay, we'll talk about aggression and learning here in just a little bit. And so the idea here is with stereotypes is that if they become learned enough, they become well ingrained, they become automatic. So you guys know this from doing math problems. Okay, so you do enough math problems, that becomes a learned ability, right? It becomes automatic. So that's one of my favorite things now. Evie's done enough of the kind of basic 2 + 6 math problems that she'll just do them. And in fact, I'll try to slow her down and be like, well, how do you know 2 + 6 = 8, buddy? Explain this to me. And she just kind of does it. It's become automatic to her. It shows that she's getting it, which makes me happy as a dad. Same things happens with stereotypes. Okay? They start to become learned over time, start to become automatic. So again, that automatic processing makes things easier. And lastly, too, as Allport points out, stereotypes are cognitive energy savers. If you're having a quick interaction with someone else, you want that interaction to go quickly and smoothly. You want to be able to make decisions efficiently. It's not an interaction that you're really all that invested in. So maybe it's just a cashier interaction at a grocery store or a gas station. You know, this allows us to get that through that interaction quickly. It doesn't cause us to have to spend a lot of energy on it. And so you can see how this is great for some contexts. But we can also see too that sometimes though we want to control our process. And what we see when we try to control our process, as Cassie was kind of alluding to at the beginning of class here, is that we're kind of overriding this automatic response that we have. So that automatic response is efficient for us. A controlled response, though, is not necessarily efficient for us. And the reason why is controlling prejudice and the use of stereotypes requires motivation and ability. Okay, so this idea of requiring motivation and ability should seem very familiar to you because these are the exact same things you have to do when someone's trying to socially influence you. Okay, to resist that social influence, you need to have motivation. Say, hey, I'm not going to be influenced by the tactics that you're using. Okay, I'm going to, have the desire to make sure I'm careful how you're interacting with me, and the ability. Okay, so if you're low in resources, you don't have the ability. Okay, if you don't have the knowledge of how techniques are being used on you, you don't have the ability to protect yourself against them. Same thing happens when we control prejudice. When we control prejudice, we have to have the motivation. So is this a context where I want to make sure I'm overriding that automatic response? Okay, I want to make sure I'm not being biased in this interaction. I want to make sure that I'm careful in terms of how I'm judging and evaluating the other person, how I'm categorizing them, the information I'm considering. And this might be the case if you're interacting with someone and they're going to hire you, that you say, yeah, I'm going to give my motivation towards understanding this person. Okay, this is going to make me more likely to be hired, more likely for me to get information about the job that I need to make a decision if I want to take it or how to best approach it. So you're motivated. You also see too that individuals may be motivated to control their prejudice, to not rely on this automatic response I have, but maybe they don't have the ability. Okay, so it's been a long day, right? Maybe there's stress because of things going on at home, things that you guys are all very familiar with right now. And, they get to the end of the day and they're interacting with someone and they say, they just start endorsing those stereotypes. Okay? They start let their prejudice comes through because they're just taxed at that point. Okay? They don't have that ability to kind of override these processes. Okay? So let me pause at this point as we kind of establish where we talk about automatic and controlled processes in the context of stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination. All right, okay, so let's unpack this. Hopefully you guys are kind of following along. This is making sense to you. So again, we see that people rely more on stereotypes when motivation or ability is hindered. Okay, so this is a key phrase, a key way of thinking about this particular section of material. Okay, so this is a helpful hint for you guys. So people rely more on stereotypes when motivation or ability is hindered. Okay, so low in motivation, they're not so concerned about things going well in that interaction, being precise in the interaction, or their ability is hindered. They don't have the resources for it. And Galen Bodenhausen in 1990 did a study that's one of my favorite studies. Okay, so this is a great study. He's one of the best researchers I know. He happened to be my undergraduate research mentor, so I have a special affinity for him. He's a really, really cool guy, super brilliant. Did this really awesome study. Now, I realize it's 8:24 in the morning, but if you're not picking up what I'm laying down, I don't know how to help you guys out. Okay, so meaning that, hey, this is worthwhile paying attention to. And what he did, and why I think this is a particularly cool study, is that he had participants label themselves either kind of morning people versus night people. Okay, and I know from this class that the majority of the class are not morning people. Okay, so I'm sorry that's the case. Hopefully it's gotten better over the course of the semester. Maybe we've regressed backwards. I was talking with Dr. Oakey. He was saying he's staying up to like 1 in the morning. And I was like, what are you doing? He's like, yeah, you know, time just flies. It's got a weird way of doing things. I was like, yeah, I get it too. I'm staying up too late as well. I know students are saying that sleeping is a little tricky. Just says, hey, let's see how morning and night people respond. When we put them in the position that they're either consistent with when they function their best or inconsistent when they function their best, based on this idea of circadian rhythms. Okay, so he's making the argument that circadian rhythms are going to decrease your motivation and ability to control your stereotype and your prejudice. And so what he did is he took prejudice measures. Okay? So he had a measure of kind of average amount of stereotype use. And what he did is he looked at what happens when he brought in morning people to do this task at 9 a.m. versus evening people in terms of how much stereotype use they have. Okay? He did a middle of the day condition. He also then did an evening condition. So morning people versus evening people. Now, for morning people like myself, what he found is that people in the morning were less likely to use stereotypes compared to these kind of evening people that were getting up early to come to a research experiment. Now, conversely, at the end of the day, morning people such as myself started to use more stereotypes compared to evening people. Evening people were starting to come into their prime. Thinking about this idea of circadian rhythms, thinking about it in terms of morning people and evening people, why does this data make sense based on what we were just talking about? Just based on that key phrase of having resources and ability and how that changes over time, changes throughout the day. Why does this results make sense based on that type of thinking?
Because if somebody is like a morning person and they get up, I mean, I don't even know how early a morning person is because I'm not. Like, I mean, I feel like some people get up at like 4 a.m., but regardless, like if they're used to getting up that early and then they go into this experiment at night, like, I don't know, like I know somebody who gets up at like 4 in the morning, but he's in bed by like 7. So
okay.
like,
okay.
You know, like if they had to come in at like 8 o'clock, like by then they're going to be tired, not only because they were up so early, but also because they're normally already in bed by that time.
Okay, so how does that affect their resources and processing?
Well, they're definitely going to be like depleted, I feel like. So they're not going to have like as much like willingness to do the controlled process versus the automatic process.
Okay, so I think you hit on that big piece towards the end, really kind of driving things home, is that in the morning people have the resources, they have the cognitive abilities. Okay, so I usually get up around 6 in the morning, a little later now, to be honest with you. And you know, that's something that, you know, by the time I hit class, actually I'm well awake. It's a good chunk of the way through the day for me. And so for me, you know, I have the ability, I have the thought processes, you know, I can put the cognitive energy towards reducing these stereotypes. Evening people, such as a few of you guys that were saying that, you know, you're taking advantage of being out of bed at 7:55 for class, which I totally get, mind you, totally get that. Okay. You know, the idea there is that this is tougher for you. You have to put a lot of resources and energy towards doing well in class, but then that means you'd be doing a lot of putting energy and resources towards controlling these stereotypes. And by the end of the day, though, morning people get depleted. Okay, so that's where they lose their skills and ability. That's where evening people start to take over. That's where they start to have better cognitive energy. I will share I had a roommate or a housemate in grad school that lived above me, and he went to Germany for a couple of months. And when he came back, he never really adjusted his time clock. So he was one of those people that, like, by 8 or 9 at night, he was asleep. And so even kind of if I had dinner with him, things like that, you kind of see he was already starting to get tired. And so as a housemate, I always made a point of kind of being quieter at that point. But he used to get up at 5 in the morning. All the time. And I was like, wow, that is dedication to be a morning person. And I will admit, one morning, there was this huge thud at 5 in the morning. It woke me up from my sleep, which of course at that point I was dead asleep. And I remember like carefully listening. I was like, is he dead up there? Like, what happened to Brady? Like, is he still alive up there? And then eventually I heard him kind of moving around, and he had a pull-out bed out of his couch, and I think it had slipped and hit the ground. I asked him about it the next day, and he was like, yeah, sorry about that. I was like, that's okay. I just, couldn't process stereotypes as well in the morning because of that. I didn't say that part, but, Okay. So again, you can see how when there's abilities and motivation, based on people's circadian rhythms, they're less likely to use these stereotypes. We see this too when we think about use of cognitive stereotypes during tasks. So I'll show you kind of two results. I'm going to ask you why do you think these results occur this way. Okay, so what researchers found, Neil McCrae, okay, is that people perform better on cognitive tasks when they're encouraged to use stereotypes. Okay, similarly, Jennifer Richardson, who's actually a MacArthur genius, so she's a certified genius. By the way, you can become a certified genius. You really have to be a genius, though, just in case you're wondering. Okay? Is that after interracial interactions, people perform worse on cognitive tasks, especially if they have strong prejudices. Thinking about, again, Gilbert's statement that people rely more on stereotypes when motivation or ability is hindered, why do we think that these two last results occur? Okay, so why are people performing better on cognitive tasks when they can use stereotypes? Or after interracial interactions, people perform worse on cognitive tasks, showing that they're depleted, especially if they have strong prejudices.
I feel like people would perform better if they were encouraged to use stereotypes just because like it's easier in general. And then if you happen to catch them like at a point where they were like depleted, like I feel like it would be even more likely, but either way, it's just an easier way of thinking. So I feel like if they were encouraged to do it, they would do the best compared to where if they were trying to not, like in the second bullet point when they perform worse would be because they were trying not to, but then, oh wait, no, hold on, I'm confused.
Okay, so I think you have the right idea, kind of think about when they use it, when's kind of easier, when it's harder. Okay,
yeah, like the second one, interracial interactions, it would be harder for them to not. Is that what it's saying? Is that what the bullet point is saying?
So it's a little bit saying more that you can kind of imagine an interracial interaction. So it's a white participant, oftentimes an African-American experimenter. Okay? And they're going through this experiment, they're going through this interaction. Sometimes it's a get to know you task. Sometimes it's kind of a simple task that you're doing with someone else. But then afterwards, they're given cognitive measures. So how difficult it is to do certain things where it requires a lot of cognitive energy, a lot of thinking. And they see it especially that when someone has a strong prejudice, after they get done with that interracial interaction, they're really not doing well on the task. Okay, so it's taking longer to do the task, there's more errors. And so the question is kind of still on the table, and Cassie's addressed it a bit, but I want to get other responses too, is that why is this the case? Okay, why is it better to just use stereotypes, makes things easier to do? Why do we see too that after going through interracial interactions, people perform worse on cognitive tasks, especially when they're highly prejudiced?
I think that they might like perform worse just because they're more like aware of it and are trying not to use the stereotypes and the prejudice they have. So I feel like it might be harder for them to like perform well just because like it's been like in their face a little bit more recently.
Okay. All right. So I think you've got it. You and Cassie, I think, have captured it well. So I appreciate the response. I'm sure others of you are thinking this way too. The idea being if they're having to kind of override maybe that prejudice response they want to have, maybe they're into that kind of aversive prejudice where they don't want to say the wrong thing, or they're trying to control all their behaviors or make sure that they're not, stuttering while they're interacting with the minority group individual. That takes a lot more cognitive resources, right? I mean, if you think about the conversation that you have with your mom, let's say, or with a parent, versus the conversation you have with your new boss or someone you're interviewing with, you have to be a lot more careful in that interview, that new boss, right? In terms of what you're saying, how you're presenting yourself. With your mom, you kind of say whatever. Folks kind of say, more or less how you're feeling. When you have to put more energy into something, okay, making that interaction go smoother, you get depleted. When you get depleted, that's where that motivation starts to become diminished, and your ability to not use those stereotyping prejudices start to become that much more hindered. And that's what we see as being affecting cognitive tasks, because they've had to maintain not using stereotypes. They've had to be motivated to be careful how they're interacting. That's depleted resources, making it harder to do those cognitive tasks afterwards. Okay, so I think you guys have that right idea, that right thinking there. And part of what comes into both of these, kind of the last piece that we'll talk about here, is our motivation to control that prejudice. Because even that piece is going to influence how hard it is to manage what's going on to help with our motivation. And there's really two types of motivation to control prejudice. One is an internal motivation, which are motivation based on strong inner beliefs. The second of which is our external motivation. The idea here is that you're going to control your motivation because it's socially unwise to express your opinion. Now, I make the argument, and I believe research supports this, that when you're more internally motivated, it's not as hard for you to reduce the amount of stereotypes, prejudice, discrimination that you have during an interaction. Okay, so you're going to come out the other side of an interaction and not be as depleted compared to if you're externally motivated. Okay, so if you're internally motivated, this is an inner drive that you have. This is reflecting your core values, your core principles, to make sure that you're treating everyone equally, to not be influenced by kind of the stereotypes of prejudice, the instant affective response that you might have after categorization. But if you're externally motivated, this takes potentially a lot of resources because you're doing something you don't agree with. Okay, so you might think of this in a slightly different context of, you're with others who have a different political view than yours, and the political side comes up, and you find yourself kind of being very careful not to express something that's contrary to the group because you just don't want to get into it. Well, that starts to become externally motivated. It's wise to you not to say something counter to their political beliefs, but that takes a lot more resources. Many of you probably had these kind of conversations where it gets kind of depleting and you just want to say something, but you get kind of taxed at it because you don't want to say something that's wrong. So we see that when we talk about our motivation, we have to think about it in terms of not just our motivation because of what we want to do, but also the external motivation. We might be careful what you're doing because you don't want to be perceived in kind of a negative and a prejudiced and discriminatory way. And so we want to see that the internal motivation is the ultimate drive for behaviors because that's easier to manage. That requires kind of less energy for us. Okay? That external motivation, though, especially is potentially in some of these cases where you see a white participant interacting with an African-American experimenter, the white participant is high in prejudice. That's working a lot on that external motivation. They don't want to be perceived as kind of this negative person who's harming this interaction with another student. So we've touched on this idea of automatic and controlled processing. We touched on a little bit of this idea of internal motivations versus external motivation. You take stereotyping, prejudice with me. We talk about internal versus external quite a bit more. But let me pause at this point before we're going to kind of look at stereotyping and prejudice in a different angle, one that we haven't covered yet. And this will be our last approach towards understanding stereotyping and prejudice, at least for this class. Okay, so let me pause for questions here.